From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
More violence and disorder in the Middle East as explosions break out in multiple parts of that part of the world as fallout increases from the war over Gaza, explosions in Iran, now ISIS taking responsibility for them, though the Iranian government still blames Israel. Plus, the U.S. seems to issue an ultimatum to the Houthis with coalition of Western governments suggesting that if the Houthis keep attacking commercial shipping, there will be, quote, consequences, unquote, to the Houthis. We will talk about what those consequences could be. Plus, Iran seems to be at the center of it all. We'll talk about the role Iran plays. And then on a separate subject, the politics of the border heats up as the new year begins and Republicans sense a political advantage. We'll talk about how that could affect the negotiations in Congress over border security and the bill to give more aid to Ukraine and Israel. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot here with our Potomac Watch podcast. I'm the editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal. I'm here with my colleagues, Kate Batchelder-Odell and Kim Strassel. Welcome to you both. Let's start with the events in the Middle East. A lot of disparate, violent events all kind of flowing together. Hard to make some sense of what they all mean. But I guess the one underlying theme is that there is some real risk, Kate, of the current conflict expanding. And I guess let's start just maybe taking on these explosions at a memorial service in Iran, 4th year anniversary of the U.S. targeting of Qasem Soleimani, the former Islamic Revolutionary Guard leader. And it was an awful event where explosions killed something like 100 people, innocent civilians, most of them. And now ISIS, which is, of course, a Sunni Muslim group, and they are opposed to the Shiite Muslims who dominate in Tehran. Does this look to you like it's that kind of terrorism, or could Iran respond in a way that widens the war if they attack Israel for it?
Iran could certainly respond in a way that widens the war, because we've seen them do that in a number of ways that we'll talk more about, such as sending a frigate into the Red Sea, such as continuing basically to associate with the Houthi cause in the Red Sea. So what Iran does here may be escalate, but it may also be an excuse to escalate, because when you looked at what happened yesterday in this horrible bombing, it was really never credible that Israel would be involved in this. Israel, for those who follow how their intelligence assets, for instance, target Iranian targets, I'll give you one example. Several years ago, Israel set up an AI weapon to take out an Iranian nuclear scientist and then detonated it from outside of the country. That is a very precise operation. It is never engaged, and there's never been any confirmation of any engagement in this kind of targeting civilians. And it wouldn't make sense for either Israel or our own interests, because we and the Israelis think that the Iranian public can be an ally against the regime. So it was never credible that this was an Israeli operation. And I think so ISIS now taking responsibility should end that discussion entirely. But the question is, how do you fit this one incident in with a larger pattern of chaos in the Middle East? And does it make Iran more volatile, and what will they do next?
We've had 2 other incidents in the last couple of days. We're getting early reports here that a U.S. drone strike hit a militia leader in Baghdad and killed that militia leader, one of the leaders of the militias that have targeted American forces in the last 2 months, certainly aggressively since October 7th. And the massacre in Israel. And that militia is allied with Iran. We don't know details yet. No doubt those will be unfolding. But that also weighs into this growing question about what Iran might do, since Iran is a sponsor of those Iraqi and Syrian militias. And then Israel targeting a Hamas leader in Beirut, one of the leaders suspected of having played a role in the October 7th massacre, Kim. And we will have to find out and see how Hezbollah, which plays such a role in the militia in Lebanon, how that militia responds and whether it escalates with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, what we have is this very disturbing and growing brew, which includes the huge number of Iranian proxies and the Western world beginning to engage in some ways, but with no formal declaration of anything. I mean, in addition to, as you note, some pushback against those Iraqi and Syrian militias, The northern border of Israel remains a hotspot where Hezbollah has been ramping up strikes from Lebanon into Israel. Israel is increasingly warning that if this doesn't stop, that they might have to take more aggressive action. But Benjamin Netanyahu was in northern Israel recently talking to troops earlier and said that, if this didn't stop, he was going to turn Beirut into a version of Gaza. So there's a lot of sword rattling going on there. Obviously, the entire mess in the Red Sea and the attacks on merchant ships. I was looking at the statistics from October 26th until yesterday, so a little bit more than 2 months. There have been at least 72 drone strikes and 21 missile attacks on ships in that area. And you have now not just Iran with not one, but 2 warships there. The Chinese are there. The Indians are there, and increasingly U.S. and U.S. ally ships are there. So this is becoming a very dangerous situation, and yet without any clarity about the United States' approach to how it's going to handle this, or any kind of official declarations or warnings to Iran, as it were.
The U.S. so far, Kate, has reacted to any of these things, has really tried very, very hard not to have any escalation. That seems to be the dominant goal of U.S. policy here, is not to escalate the conflict. In many ways, understandable. Nobody wants the conflict to escalate. But when you look at the various actors here, they all point to Iran as the kind of the fulcrum, the centerpiece of what's going on there. And the U.S. has been very wary of engaging Iran in any way that they think would give it an excuse to escalate the conflict. And yet you get an opposing point of view by some former American officials who think that, in fact, the way to stop some of this is, in fact, actually to strike these Iranian allies, these proxies, and maybe even Iranian assets themselves. For example, if the ships that the Iranians are sending to the Red Sea create trouble there, the U.S. could defend itself by attacking one of those and sinking them.
Right. With all this talk about how our first priority is not to escalate, well, we also have other priorities like protecting U.S. troops. So we should be honest that escalation is not the only consideration that we have. I think, too, when you look at what Iran is doing here, we have not, for instance, even hit some of these Houthi launch sites, some of their radars, some of the assets they're using to launch these strikes on container ships. That would be one very obvious place to start. We know where these are. We know where the Houthi leadership is. These are targets that we could hit. But also, I think you do have to acknowledge that we know a lot about Iran's role arming the Houthis. We know that based on intelligence leaks, there's an Iranian spy ship that has basically been assisting the Houthis with real-time intelligence and drones and some of these attacks. And we know now Iran has basically been willing to publicly broadcast its own association with the Houthi cause by sending that 50-year-old frigate into the Red Sea to swan around and show that Iran really is the regional power. So I do think step one, even the baseline should be attacks on the Houthis and their ability to continue to launch these attacks. But I don't think you will get this situation to calm down as the White House so desperately wants, unless you do tell the Iranians that they are putting their own assets at risk by allowing this behavior to continue. We are seeing U.S. officials, there was a statement yesterday out of the administration saying that there will be consequences of an unnamed variety if it continues. Now, that doesn't look like a red line like Obama's red line in Syria, but maybe they're getting the marker out to try to enforce some consequence here. But it only matters if the Iranians think that warning is meaningful and that the U.S. will follow through with it if these attacks continue.
Okay, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk more about this seeming ultimatum from the U.S. and its allies against the Houthis when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on Potomac Watch with Kim Strassel and Kate Odell. And before the break, we were talking about this joint statement that was issued on January 3rd by the United States and a dozen other countries. And it seemed to be the strongest statement yet by this new coalition that was formed by the United States to be able to escort shipping safely through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and keep it protected from attacks by the Iranian allies, the Houthis in Yemen. And it was very tough language. As it said, we hereby reiterate the following and warn the Houthis against further attacks. And then very tough language about how these attacks are illegal, unacceptable, and profoundly destabilizing. And then it goes through the costs of these in global shipping and for the economy. And then it says, let our message now be clear. We call for the immediate end of these illegal attacks and release of unlawfully detained vessels and crews. The Houthis will bear the responsibility of the consequences should they continue to threaten lives, the global economy, and free flow of commerce in the region's critical waterways, unquote. So, Kim, the Houthis will bear the responsibility of the consequences. How do you define consequences? But that sure seems, it's pretty close to a red line, it seems to me.
I agree. Although one thing that I would note is not only did it not explain the consequences, but no mention of Iran as the operator behind all of the region's problems and violence. And, this is a problem because at some point, the United States and its allies are going to have to address the Iranian threat and do it directly because we're sort of playing their game, as it were. They deliberately use all these proxies to kind of keep a hands-off thing, even though it is Iran providing them weapons and intelligence, financial support and training, but they leave it to those proxies. And when we simply address them and not the root cause, you have to wonder where we're actually getting. It's at least a good step, Paul, because this merchant shipping issue is really growing in problems. We've got growing supply chain issues as a result of it. Insurance rates are soaring. Freight rates have doubled. And there's also the threat to lives, not just those on the merchant ships, but the various sailors and others enlisted from a number of different countries that have promised to safeguard this merchant shipping, and as a result are walking closer to combat and conflict all the time. So I was glad to see it, but now the real question is going to be, is it a red line and do they follow up on it? Because if they don't do anything now, having issued that ultimatum, then it's really a problem because the Houthis and Iran, by extension, will feel that there are no consequences to flouting that sort of declaration.
Yeah, the lack of any mention of Iran here was significant in my mind. They focused entirely on the Houthis, which, of course, are doing the direct action. But everybody knows the U.S. has actually said in the past that the Iranians have helped with intelligence and certainly they help with weapons. So the real question becomes, Kate, to what degree, if there is a kinetic response here against the Houthis, what do they do? I mean, do they take out the launch sites, which we know where they are? Do they take out the weapon stores? We know where they are. And then if they do that, what does Iran do with its naval assets now in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden? The last time the Iranians have engaged the U.S. in any significant action, I guess, 1988 back then. I mean, there may have been one since, but it didn't turn out well for the Iranians. They know that they'll lose that kind of engagement, but it's possible that could lead to that.
Sure. I mean, Operation Praying Mantis, which was the 1988 action you were referring to, was a single day of action for the U.S. Navy. That's how quickly almost half the Iranian Navy was sunk. And also, I think one note about that episode, too, is that it was in response to a U.S. ship tripping on an Iranian mine and absorbing a tremendous damage. And our response was overwhelming, and it was only 4 days later. I think part of the problem that we're getting at here is that the Iranians don't believe anymore that we are willing to respond in such a way. And that is why we're seeing this more flagrant behavior. I think it's worth dwelling on. This international naval coalition was announced several weeks ago now.
I think about 2 weeks ago, yeah.
Right, and was supposed to calm down and serve as a deterrent to further attacks. It simply is not working. In fact, in one of these recent exchanges the U.S. had with the Houthis during one of these attacks, the U.S. sent helicopters while these boats were trying to board a container ship, these boats of armed rebels, and they started shooting at the U.S. helicopters. Then, of course, in self-defense, the helicopters sunk the Houthi boats. But I think the extent to which this international naval coalition and the extent to which that the American deterrent power is no longer discouraging our adversaries from taking these kinds of violent actions is really startling. So I think you have to conclude here that what the Biden administration has done so far has not worked. And I think the stepped up threat, at least maybe, is some partial recognition of that. And the $1 million question, as Kim said, is whether they follow through with that. And I'd add, it's not just Iran that's watching whether they follow through with that. This isn't a very large test of American will because, this is a global shipping lane that a terrorist group has taken hostage. Other powers, including the Chinese Communist Party, are following this very closely to see whether the U.S. has the muscle to enforce its interests.